All right, we're going to finish up the memory PowerPoint. So right now we're talking about forgetting. And there's a famous researcher named Ebbinghaus who was very interested in memory. So he made himself a series of nonsense syllables. So it'd be like, I don't know, J, O, well, that's a word. That wasn't it. Maybe JPX, okay? JPX. And then he would try to remember a series of these, and then he would test himself after certain amounts of time. And doing all this, he came up with a forgetting curve. And this is something we see over and over again in memory testing, but he was the first one to kind of produce one and describe it. So if he tried to recall the nonsense syllables immediately, he did quite well. But if he waited even 20 minutes, his memory went down quite a bit. And then you can see different amounts of time. And it got to a point where after, a little bit after a day had passed, that was about as good as his memory was going to get. And it was about 30%. So he just was the first to describe this. And we see this all the time in with material that people have to remember, that they just, they lose that information quite quickly unless they do something to make that information more memorable. So why do people forget? Why do we think that people forget information? Basically, it's that the information never got into their long-term memory in the first place. So we would call that a lack of encoding. So for instance, think of a penny. Can you describe whose face is on the penny? Can you describe which way his face is oriented? What about the back of a penny? Can you remember what's on the back of a penny? When it comes to really specific details like this, even on things we see all the time, we don't pay attention to them, so we don't remember them, okay? Another way that we forget information is just through decay, which basically means that the memory erodes over time or kind of fades over time. It just kind of fades from our memory. So those are the main two reasons why people forget. Sometimes you know that you've studied something, you know it's in your brain somewhere, but you can't pull it out. That would be retrieval failure, basically. So there might be other information that's interfering with what you're trying to remember. That's usually what happens here. There's also, this is fairly rare and even a little bit controversial, but sometimes something has happened to us and we don't want to remember it. And so it's as if our brain represses that information. It keeps us from remembering something that will be painful to us. Another aspect of forgetting is something called reconstruction. And here we reconstruct memories, we bring a memory back to mind, but it's subject to distortion, it's subject to error. So we might remember something that kind of fits in with our beliefs or with the way we wish it had gone. There really is a lot of different things that come into play when we're trying to remember something. So remember schemas? We talked about schemas. So maybe we filter information through our existing schemas. So if you meet someone and you're told that they are an aeronautic engineer, you are going to tend to have a schema in your head for what a rocket scientist is and how smart they are. And you're going to kind of bring that back into play when you try to describe that person to someone else. So for instance, maybe you remember them as having glasses when they don't wear glasses. So just, I guess the take-home message here is our memories are subject to error. We do not remember things just like a camera picture or a video recording. We have to be a little bit skeptical about our memory because it may not be how something happened. Now, sometimes schemas can help our memory and help us remember that that engineer was really smart because we have kind of a schema for a rocket scientist, if you will. So sometimes schemas can be helpful, but other times they can hinder an actual true memory. The misinformation effect, this is something they actually talked about in that video we watched the last Friday of class with Elizabeth Loftus. So if you remember in that video, people watched an event and she was asking them questions about the event, but remember she planted two Confederates, two people who were kind of in cahoots with Elizabeth Loftus and who actually hadn't been there. And they both said something that was incorrect. And then later, some of the actual witnesses incorporated that incorrect fact into their memory for the event. So again, this just shows us that memory is fallible. It's not perfect. And it's a good thing for us to kind of know about ourselves. Okay, autobiographical memory. What do we remember about our own lives? In general, we tend to remember things that happened recently a lot better than things that happened long ago. An exception to this might be in older adults where they seem to remember a lot from their childhood and adolescence, maybe early 20s. Have you ever noticed that? Like if you've been talking to your grandma or grandpa, they might not remember what happened yesterday, but boy, they can tell you a story about their childhood. But most of us tend to remember recent events better. We tend to remember transitional first, so the first time we drove a car, the first time we went on a date. Unique events, things that are kind of different, we tend to remember those. Flashbulb memories, these are things for my generation. It might be 9/11. Where were you? What were you doing when you heard about the plane hitting the trade tower? For you guys, it might be this whole coronavirus thing that you'll be able to remember maybe what you were doing when you first heard that school is canceled. The last thing is childhood amnesia. We tend to not remember events from our early childhood very well. Usually it's around 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there when you start remembering things from your childhood. They think this might have something to do with language, that once we kind of learn language and can describe something, that makes it more in our conscious memory and easier to remember. A few other things about memory. We tend to be egocentric in our memories. We remember ourselves as part of a situation or part of a scene, and we might give ourselves kind of a bigger role in something that happened than we actually had. Hindsight bias comes back again. So after an event, we kind of think we knew all along what was going to happen. And then we revise our memories to reflect favorably on ourselves. We tend to be kind of optimists, and we tend to remember ourselves in a favorable light. Okay. All right, how do you improve your memory? There's a whole section of this, a section on this in your chapter. It's around page 268. So do take a look at it. There are some really interesting strategies there. So they talk about mnemonics, and these are things like rhymes and acronyms. So Roy G. Biv for the colors of the rainbow, right? There are also mnemonic systems. So one of these is the method of loci, and that just means place memory. So like if you picture a walk you took on campus really often, so maybe you started off at your dorm, and then maybe you passed the big clock, and you saw the fountain, and then you walked towards Harbert, and you passed under the bell tower, and then you got to Harbert, okay? So if you have a list of things to remember, you somehow place them in a location. So first, you're trying to remember, gosh, I don't know, let's say it's a grocery list, and you're trying to remember milk. And so you think of milk pouring over the clock and just covering it, okay? And then you see the fountain, and the next item to remember is butter. So you picture a bunch of sticks of butter floating around in the fountain, and so on. Okay, so read about the method of loci in your text, because some people actually find that pretty helpful. And this is how that memory expert that we saw in the video last Friday, he used this to help him remember items. Okay. All right. I think this is it. Is that it? Oh, the peg word method. That's another one. So you'd say 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, and you imagine what you're trying to remember interacting with those items. Okay. All right. That is it for memory. Do please let me know if you have any questions. Okay. See you later.